June 22, 1941. Along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, German artillery opens fire and armored columns begin moving east into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa is supposed to destroy the Red Army in a short campaign, before the distances of the Soviet interior can turn movement into exhaustion. The opening seems to confirm the gamble. German formations tear through frontier defenses, surround large Soviet forces, and advance hundreds of kilometers. But behind the tanks is a second army moving at a very different speed. Infantry on foot, artillery behind horses, fuel trucks searching for passable roads, railway troops trying to make captured track usable. Barbarossa is remembered for panzers racing east. Its hidden problem was that the supply system could not race with them. German planning had recognized the enormous distances involved, but it depended on one decisive assumption: the Soviet state and its main field armies would collapse quickly. The campaign was expected to last weeks, not become a prolonged war deep inside the Soviet Union. That assumption shaped everything. Germany did not build a logistical system designed to sustain continuous high-intensity operations all the way to Moscow and beyond. It built one intended to support a rapid destruction of Soviet forces near the western frontier. The difference became critical almost immediately. The geography was unforgiving. The Soviet Union possessed an enormous railway network, but its rail gauge differed from the German system. Much of the road network was also poorly suited to the constant movement of heavy military traffic. German trains could not simply roll forward behind the army. Captured railway lines had to be repaired, converted, and connected to an operating supply network before locomotives could carry fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and replacements toward the front. The railroad was not a convenience. It was the backbone of the campaign. The problem was that every kilometer the armored spearheads gained increased the distance between the fighting units and the railheads feeding them. Supplies arrived by rail. They were unloaded, transferred to trucks, moved forward over difficult roads, then, in many divisions, transferred again to horse-drawn transport. Every transfer consumed time, fuel, labor, and vehicles. The farther the front moved east, the more transport capacity was spent simply moving supplies across the growing gap. A truck could carry the same load, but if its round trip doubled in length, it completed fewer deliveries. More trucks were then required simply to maintain the same flow. But those extra trucks also needed fuel, tires, mechanics, and replacement parts. Distance was not just space on a map. It was a multiplier acting against the entire transportation system. Germany also entered the Soviet Union with a force that looked more mechanized than it really was. The armored and motorized formations at the front gave the campaign its speed, but most German infantry divisions still depended heavily on horses. Hundreds of thousands of horses pulled artillery, wagons, kitchens, ammunition, and supplies. They reduced fuel demand, but created another requirement: fodder. The horses, also tired, became sick and struggled in mud and extreme weather. The German army therefore contained two different tempos. The panzer groups could surge forward. Much of the army behind them could not. Trucks were supposed to bridge that gap, but Germany's motor transport system had weaknesses before the invasion even began. The army used a wide mixture of vehicle types, including captured trucks from across occupied Europe. Different engines, tires, axles, and spare parts complicated maintenance. A truck that broke down hundreds of kilometers inside the Soviet Union did not merely remove one vehicle. It reduced the carrying capacity of a supply network already operating near its limits. Early victories made this weakness harder to see. At Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, and later Kyiv. German forces destroyed or captured huge Soviet formations. From Berlin and the forward headquarters, the campaign could still look like the rapid collapse planners had predicted. But the Red Army kept producing new formations and trading space for time. Soviet resistance forced German units to fight repeated battles instead of simply advancing into a defeated state. Every battle consumed ammunition. Every kilometer consumed fuel. Every disabled tank demanded recovery or repair. Every new encirclement created prisoners, security problems, and roads crowded with military traffic. The offensive was succeeding tactically while becoming harder to sustain operationally. By July and August, the distance itself was changing the campaign.
Army Group Center had advanced towards Smolensk, but its armored formations had suffered losses and mechanical attrition. Supply columns had to travel farther from functioning railheads. Roads deteriorated under heavy traffic and summer dust. The front was no longer a sharp line moving east. It had become a vast transportation problem stretching backward across Poland, Belarus, and the occupied Soviet territories. This is where the famous argument over Moscow becomes more complicated. Hitler and the German High Command disagreed about priorities after the initial battles. Forces from Army Group Center were diverted toward the north and especially toward Ukraine before the main drive on Moscow resumed. That decision mattered, but it did not occur in a logistical vacuum. The German armies already needed time to repair vehicles, reorganize units, move supplies forward, and convert railway lines. Strategic choices and logistics were interacting. Modern military terminology describes this problem as operational reach, the distance and duration across which a force can successfully employ military power. The speed of the German advance was carrying its combat formations beyond the capacity of the system sustaining them. In September, the Germans won another enormous encirclement around Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were taken prisoner. On paper, it looked like proof that the original method still worked, but time had passed. Vehicles had accumulated wear. Horses were exhausted. Roads and railways still had to support armies spread across an immense front. Soviet losses were catastrophic, yet the Soviet state had not collapsed. Industry was being evacuated eastward. New formations were appearing. Reserves were being assembled. The German plan had required military destruction to produce political and strategic collapse. Instead, battlefield destruction produced another demand for movement and supply. When Operation Typhoon, the renewed offensive toward Moscow, began in early October, German forces again achieved major encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. But the season was turning. Autumn rain transformed many unpaved roads into mud. The problem was not simply that mud slowed tanks, it slowed the entire supply chain. Trucks burned more fuel. They suffered more breakdowns. They covered less distance. Horse-drawn wagons struggled through the same routes. Recovery vehicles became occupied, pulling other vehicles free. A road that could carry a column in dry weather could become a bottleneck after rain.
The logistical system lost capacity precisely when the front demanded more. Then, temperatures fell. Winter is often presented as the explanation for Barbarossa's failure, but winter did not create the fundamental logistical problem. It intensified one that had existed from the beginning. German forces lacked adequate winter preparation in forward areas. Vehicles that were already worn became harder to operate. Horses suffered badly. But the deeper issue was that the campaign had lasted into winter at all. Barbarossa's logistics were designed around the expectation that decisive victory would come before these conditions mattered. By late November and early December, German troops reached the approaches to Moscow, but the offensive had lost much of the mobility that had defined June. Panzer strength had been reduced, infantry formations were depleted, supply lines were stretched, Soviet resistance was increasing. In the first week of December, Soviet counteroffensives struck the German front around Moscow. The advance
stopped. German forces were pushed back in several sectors. Operation Barbarossa had failed to destroy the Soviet Union in a short campaign. Logistics did not defeat Germany by itself. Soviet resistance, Soviet mobilization, German strategic decisions, combat losses, intelligence failures, terrain, weather, and the enormous scale of the theater all mattered. But logistics connected them. The campaign consumed distance faster than Germany could convert that distance into sustainable military power. Railways had to be rebuilt. Trucks had to survive roads they were not designed to use continuously. Horses had to feed and move. Fuel had to travel forward while the vehicles carrying it burned fuel of their own. The farther the panzers advanced, the more expensive every additional kilometer became. Barbarossa's central contradiction was simple. Germany's operational concept depended on speed, but its supply system depended on a slower army, limited roads, converted railways, worn trucks, and hundreds of thousands of horses. The invasion did not stop because the German army suddenly forgot how to attack. It reached the limit of how far its system could keep the attack alive.